Key point 1. The Golden State Killer. The name Golden State Killer was coined by Michelle McNamara. According to her, he committed crimes all over California. He's also known as the East Area Rapist, Early Bird Rapist, and Original Night Stalker, who terrorized neighborhoods and committed 50 rapes in Northern California and 20 murders in Southern California. For over 4 decades, the killer was at large and remained unidentified. His signature methods of entering his victims' homes when no one was there, studying the layout and family pictures, unlocking sliding windows, and emptying bullets from guns were ritualistic. While his victims slept, unbothered, he would force their eyes open by wielding a flashlight in their sight and speaking in what they described as a threatening guttural whisper that sent shivers down their spine. His attacks always appeared to be intelligent and well-planned, which some said may have been attributed to his military training. Precision and self-preservation were the identifying features of the Golden State Killer. Around the time of his crimes, he was between 18 and 30, Caucasian, well-built, and always wore a mask. He began with serial rape, stalking and attacking girls and women in their bedrooms, then proceeded to surprising couples in their sleep and binding them before killing them. He would leave behind personal belongings such as jewelry and wall clocks. The case stretched over a decade and revolutionized DNA analysis in crime investigation. This summary reveals how a criminal mastermind got away with his crimes for decades until his day of reckoning. Inside everyone lurks a Sherlock Holmes that believes given the right amount of clues, they could solve a mystery. Michelle McNamara. Key point 2. An obsessive search for a serial rapist and killer. Michelle McNamara spent a lot of time and resources trying to figure out the Golden State Killer's identity. Her obsession with unsolved murders began in Oak Park, Illinois, when she was 14. Kathleen Lombardo, a 24-year-old woman in McNamara's neighborhood, was jogging one evening near her house with her Walkman when her killer dragged her into an alley and murdered her in cold blood by slitting her throat. 2 days after the murder, McNamara walked to the spot where Lombardo was killed and picked up the shattered pieces of her Walkman. Right there, she developed a great curiosity about the identity of the killer, and unsolved murders became an obsession for her. Police dismissed the story that witnesses saw the killer exit the train and follow her. The rumor gave the impression that the killer came from somewhere else. In her mid-30s, McNamara followed her passion and launched her DIY detective website, True Crime Diary. The True Crime Diary website attempted to solve cold and developing cases. The case of Kathleen's murder was put aside, but McNamara continued writing about it and bringing it up in interviews. 26 years after the strange case, McNamara received a letter from Dan Ollis, her childhood friend, who had seen an interview where she mentioned the murder. He explained that during the time Lombardo was murdered, other boys and himself had seen her body. They felt they knew the identity of the killer who lived among them, a man of Indian descent who simultaneously walked out of the alley when they discovered the body. Still, Kathleen Lombardo's killer was never caught. Key point 3. Murder in Irvine and Dana Point, California. David and Manuela Withune lived in Irvine, California. In February 1981, David was admitted to the hospital for severe gastrointestinal disease. Manuela had a routine of visiting her parents' house for dinner, then David at the hospital, before going back home. They spoke on the phone every day and night. One day, Manuela didn't answer David's call. He tried calling her at work, but learned she never showed up that day. He phoned her mother to check on Manuela at home, where she was found lying dead on the bed. Marks on her wrists indicated her hands and ankles had been bound. Investigators discovered that Manuela's killer used a heavy lamp to bludgeon her to death. Some pieces of jewelry and the tape from the answering machine were missing, suggesting the killer left his voice on the machine. Some people thought Manuela knew her killer and suspected her husband or a lover. The crime was odd to the Irvine Police Department, but Orange County criminalist Jim White thought it was familiar upon his inspection of the scene. A professional criminalist examines crime scenes to protect relevant evidence. Jim White had inspected various crime scenes across the county. Working for the Orange County Sheriff's Department gave him the advantage of accessing its crime lab used by most local police departments and enabled him to connect cases across departments. He thought Manuela Withune's murder had similarities to that of Keith and Patty Harrington, a couple in Dana Point, California, that had occurred 6 months earlier. In both cases, the killer bludgeoned his victims to death in their beds, bound, as evidenced by ligature marks on the bodies, and raped the females and took the murder weapon with him when he left the scene. Wooden matches and short burns, believed to belong to the killer, were also collected in both houses. Unfortunately, authorities dismissed the possible connection between the cases, which eventually went cold. The early 90s marked the beginning of DNA testing in the crime lab, reminding Jim White of his old suspicion. With the help of another criminalist, Mary Hong, they discovered a connection between the cases and, surprisingly, with that of 18-year-old Janelle Cruz, who was found dead in her family's Irvine home on May 5, 1986. Key point 4. The East Area Rapist strikes in Sacramento. Between 1976 and 1977, the Golden State Killer, also known as the East Area Rapist, EAR, struck 14 times in Sacramento. His attacks started in Rancho Cordova on June 18, 1976. The victim explained he was moderately muscular and wore gloves but no pants. He tied her wrists with a cord, gagged her mouth, and ordered her not to make a sound. After the fifth assault, detectives Richard Shelby and Carol Daly began their investigations. 3 more attacks followed that same month, and by November 1976, the Golden State Killer / East Area Rapist had struck 9 times within the space of 6 months in Sacramento County. Victims identified the man as a masked white man, about 5 feet 9 inches, in his 20s or 30s, who spoke with an angry whisper and raised his voice to a higher pitch whenever he was upset. He had specific psychosexual needs. He bound his victims' hands and forced them to masturbate him. When attacking couples, he'd take the woman to the living room and cover the TV to change the lighting. He never hurt children physically, but would put the younger children away in a separate room and tie up the older ones. The sheriff's department initially asked the local press to leave the crimes unpublicized so that the spotlight wouldn't drive the EAR away. Shelby, Daly, and other detectives quietly chased leads. But on October 18th, when the EAR attacked twice in 24 hours, the press blackout was over and the story was released. The same day the press released the story, the EAR launched his 9th attack, pointing a knife at a 16-year-old girl watching TV alone and warning her not to make a move or she would be silent forever, before disappearing into the dark. Sacramento had about 5 serial rapists in the 1970s, but the East Area Rapist stood out. By May 1997, the East Area Rapist had struck 20 times in Sacramento. Almost 3,000 guns were sold between January and May, and couples often slept in shifts, with one pointing a rifle at the window. The EAR later moved from the east side to the south side. Did you know? The rate of violent crime in the U.S. rose through the 1960s and 1970s, peaking in the early 1980s. Key point 5. How the original Night Stalker learned to be careful. In 1979, a man known as the original Night Stalker in Goleta, California, ordered a woman to tie up her boyfriend. He then tied her up, took her to the living room, and began pacing, cursing, and chanting to himself repeatedly that he would kill them. In a rush of fear, the woman managed to escape through the front door, while her boyfriend ran out the back door. Their neighbor, an FBI agent, heard the scream and came out in time to see the man riding away on a stolen bike. He gave the man a chase, but he dropped the bike and jumped over the fence between 2 houses. The couple described the original Night Stalker, which was probably when the man decided no other of his victims would be alive to tell. The original Night Stalker committed his first murder in December 1979. In December, Dr. Robert Offerman, an osteopathic surgeon, and his girlfriend, Alexandria Manning, were murdered. Manning lay on the bed with her wrists bound with white nylon twine, while Offerman was at the foot of the bed on his knees with the same twine binding his hands. Specific evidence was left: pry marks, a star-shaped pattern from the killer's Adidas shoes, and a length of nylon twine. Residents of the neighborhood reported ransacking and burglaries on the day of the murder. Several days later, investigators continued discovering pieces of nylon twine in various locations. In 1981, the killer murdered another couple. Police found that the 24 blunt wounds on the male's body were inflicted by the same unknown instrument his killer used to bludgeon the female to death. This time, the killer took the ligatures and the murder weapon, thus eliminating the evidence. Investigators went from door to door, and many couples testified to having had strange encounters with the man. In 2000, in Orange County, Larry Poole recognized similarities between the Goleta attacks and Irvine. Years later, in 2011, the Goleta cases were conclusively linked to the East Area Rapist through DNA technology. Key point 6. The original Night Stalker is linked to the East Area Rapist. In Contra Costa County, criminalist Paul Holes learned about the East Area Rapist in 1997. He found that between October 1978 and July 1979, there were 11 ear cases in the East Bay. Though the crime lab of the Contra Costa County's Sheriff's Office, CCCSO, wasn't as advanced as the other California labs, Paul Holes made a profile of the rapist. They discovered it was the same man in Sacramento that resurfaced in the East Bay in Contra Costa County. Paul Holes had a basic DNA profile of the killer. Later, new available technology would help expand the profile. He began checking case files and calling victims and retired detectives. He tracked down Larry Crompton, a retired detective on the CCCSO's ear task force, who had taken the cases to heart. Holes needed Crompton's knowledge of old suspects to connect them, potentially, with the ear. Crompton asked him to start with Santa Barbara. He had heard rumors of cases similar to the ear years earlier, but the Santa Barbara County Sheriff's Department stonewalled. Even after 2 decades, they denied having any cases that looked like what he was describing. They pointed to Irvine, where Holes met criminalist Mary Hong of the Orange County Sheriff's Department. When Holes and Hong met, the CCCSO's crime lab wasn't as good as that of Orange County, but they joined their efforts to solve the ear case. After a year and a half, the CCCSO's crime lab would catch up to Orange County's, and DNA linked the East Area rapist from Sacramento to the original Night Stalker in East Bay. Key point 7. Forming alliances from a shared obsession. Michelle McNamara delighted in finding people who shared her obsession with discovering the identity of serial killers. In 2012, she met with investigators and detectives to gather information about the Golden State Killer's identity, now called the Ear-Ons, East Area Rapist, Original Night Stalker. She met with the social worker who operated like a gatekeeper between the Sacramento investigators and the message board community, an internet group devoted to collecting evidence and new theories on the Ear-Ons. McNamara also met with Paul Haynes, whom she called the Kid. He eventually became her research assistant and once spent almost 4,000 hours searching for likely subjects from Ancestry.com to USSearch.com. He also got a copy of the 1997 Sacramento Suburban Directory and the 1983 Orange County Telephone Directory. He compiled the data into the Master List, which contained 2,000 names along with dates of birth, addresses, criminal records, and photos. McNamara was relieved to find Haynes, who shared her obsession. They both seemed a bit self-conscious. In Sacramento, McNamara met with Richard Shelby, then scheduled an interview with Larry Poole in Orange County, who explained that 8,000 suspects have been examined over the years and emphasized the importance of DNA tests to eliminate suspects. McNamara also met with Paul Holes, who shared his theories about the Golden State Killer and took her to tour various crime scenes where he struck in Contra Costa County: San Ramon, Danville, Walnut Creek, and Davis. Key point 8. The death of Michelle McNamara. At just 46 years old, Michelle McNamara died in her sleep on April 21, 2016. Her undiagnosed heart condition was intensified by pain and anxiety relief medication. A week after her death, Paul Haynes and Billy Jensen, an investigative journalist, got hold of over 3,000 of her files on the Golden State Killer. They also had many notebooks, police reports, and almost 40 boxes of files. Before her death, she was midway through writing I'll Be Gone in the Dark, and Haynes and Jensen cooperated to wrap up and organize her materials. Michelle struggled with insomnia, and whenever she couldn't sleep, she would always sleuth for ear suspects. Michelle McNamara spent her life searching for the monster who had taken 10 lives and raped over 50 women. Michelle had collected thousands of pieces of evidence from over 55 crime scenes. She tagged one document on her hard drive as possibly interesting people. It was a list that contained notes and nuggets of information on potential suspects. On her blog, True Crime Diary, Michelle left several questions open. Readers would contribute with clues and theories. She would take all the help she could get to find the killer. A crime scene is time-sensitive and always on the verge of collapse. Every person who enters represents the possibility for contamination. Michelle McNamara. Investigators believed the Golden State Killer lived or worked in Sacramento, while his most basic characteristics, face and name, remained unknown. A year before Michelle McNamara's death, Paul Haynes had begun using geographic profiling to check the possible zones near the Golden State Killer's dwelling place. Geographical profiling means analyzing locations linked to a crime to determine a serial offender's anchor points. Most of the events of the case revolved around Sacramento, making it the most relevant location in the search. In theory, identifying the Golden State Killer involved identifying people who lived in Sacramento until the late 1970s and then moved to Southern California. While geographic profiling and DNA databases were the best strategies for Paul Haynes and Billy Jensen to find the man's identity, both methods had limitations. But Haynes and Jensen determined not to stop until they identified the Golden State Killer. Conclusion: Michelle McNamara spent her last years chasing the Golden State Killer. Unfortunately, she didn't live long enough to see him caught. But as she got closer to solving the crime, still she craved justice, not glory, and was aware of the danger of her obsession. She was so committed that she continued her search despite her failing health and lack of sleep. Michelle's husband, Patton Oswalt, said he was sure the killer didn't have much time before he'd be caught. Coincidentally, the police arrested Joseph James DeAngelo, age 72, on April 25, 2018, near his home of 30 years in Citrus Heights. DeAngelo, a former Auburn police officer, was linked through DNA evidence as the Golden State Killer and charged with 20 counts of homicide, 50 rapes, and the ransacking of over 120 homes. Finally, identifying the killer brought closure for victims, families, and detectives who had been searching for clues for years. But most important was the validation for Michelle McNamara, who spent so much of her time and effort searching for the identity of this criminal. Michelle McNamara's story proves that hard work and proper determination can give good results that will outlive a person even when they're long gone. Try this. Don't be afraid to go after the things you are passionate about. Be honest about your obsessions and don't hesitate to seek help concerning them. Also, prioritize your health, safety, and well-being.